Welcome back to the Racial Draft Podcast. We are back in 2025, a podcast where we change the complexion of the comic book universe one draft pick at a time. Like I said, our first podcast of the new year. I know it's been a while. Sorry about the layoff. We're about a month down, which means we're 4 rounds behind in our recapping of the season 8 Racial Draft. So to that end, we're going to bring you a number of podcasts in a row as we break down round 5, round 6, round 7, and round 8 of our racial draft. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, first off, I apologize, but this is a great time to get on board where we can talk about what we do here, which is reimagine these characters through the various racial and ethnic umbrellas that come from the drafting process. We have 10 delegations, and the 10 delegations try to either claim, reclaim, or solidify characters within these identities. And, this is a different time for identity politics, and we are going to try as best as we can to navigate that world in a fun way through the racial draft. And kicking us off is a character who's very much familiar with navigating certain kinds of identity. And Professor X, Charles Xavier, traditionally imagined as a white man, as a very privileged white man, if we're being honest. He was drafted with the first pick in the 5th round by the Black delegation. Now, granted, there are certain aspects of his character that do fit well within the idea of being a person of color, particularly with regard to the notion of being a model minority, or at least pursuing respectability politics. A lot of what Charles Xavier stands for is this notion that if mutants did the right thing, showed their identity, were proud about their mutant identity, but also showed they were some of the good ones in a world where many mutants aren't one of the good ones. Charles Xavier puts himself out there at the forefront of the good mutants movement, and particularly the X-Men are at the forefront of the branding of who the good mutants should be. Now, granted, that has not always been the case. Sometimes they have been quite radical, but it is part and parcel of Charles Xavier's dream that mutants live harmoniously with non-mutants as part of the human race. And, and a big part of that ideology in it of his dream is that if they can only show to the rest of humanity that they're not a threat, they're not a danger, that one day the oppression will stop. Now, granted, I think that it is a little bit challenging to imagine a black man touting those things, but on the other hand, given that a lot of people do associate Charles Xavier's dream with that of Martin Luther King, when was that Martin Luther King Day this past week. And, I think it's a little bit, I don't think it's that challenging. I think it's well within the thought process of the Black delegation to imagine Charles Xavier as a Black man while still, having a lot of privilege that would allow him to have such a positive view of humanity. To that end, though, it's not terribly disappointing, or at least surprising, I'd say, that the voters, that the audience, is a little bit more mixed than that. We have a number of ways that we can make our opinions felt with respect to the picks. We have places that you can vote. You can vote on the website, racialdraft.com, where our polls for the whole season are ongoing for every pick. So go ahead and cast your votes there. We can also cast your votes on Instagram, also ongoing for the entire season. Blue Sky, we do not have a poll as of yet, but you can still see our picks there. Follow us there. Keep up with what's happening. And also on Twitter, we have a poll there, as well as, on Threads. We have polls where you can, make your voices heard about whether you like or dislike, or approve or disapprove, rather, of these picks as they come through. So to that end, 66.6% of the voters on Twitter approved of Black Professor X, with 33.3 strongly approving and 33.3 somewhat approving. Unfortunately, 33.3 strongly disapproving of Black Professor X. So, 2 out of every 3, not the best percentage, but, still something on the positive side, more than 50%. Moving on from the Black delegation to the Native American delegation. This is a character that has been drafted by the Native American delegation before. I personally think it's a good pick. I'll go ahead and jump in and give my opinion after I announce it, and that is Jason Todd for the Native American delegation. Like I said, it's been a pick that's been chosen before by the Native American delegation. Obviously, there's a notion of red being associated with Native Americans, unfortunately, through stereotypes and slurs. But there's also the idea that he's the one of the Robins, of the Batman sidekicks. He came up the roughest. He also had the roughest go of it. He also was the one that died. And his death wasn't something that was taken lightly. Obviously, this is outside of the realm of comic storylines, but because he was positioned as the not as good Robin compared to Dick Grayson, the original Robin, a lot of people felt like he was expendable. And, isn't that very common to the Black experience or the experience of being a person of color, not feeling like you can measure up to, some standard? And for that reason, your death not being viewed as much of a tragedy. I think that that's a big part of the chip on Red Hood's shoulder when he comes back from the dead. The idea that his death was not as tragic as it might have been if, not firstborn, but the first Robin, first chosen Robin, somehow tragedy befall him. Obviously, a lot of that is reconciled. He's still a part of the family, but he's in a lot of ways apart from the family, that being the Bat family. And he goes his own way as the leader of the Outlaws, Red Hood. And again, I think that experience, that posture does lend itself positively to the Red Hood, being within the realm of any group of minorities, but particularly the Native American delegation, I'd say. So it's for the reason that I approve personally, but the voters and racialdraft.com, polls still open for that. But on Twitter, where the polls have closed, 100% approval rating for Native American Red Hood, and I have to concur with it. Moving on, is another character that has also had some tragedy befall them, albeit of a different type. This is a legacy character who you really know if you've seen both Logan and Deadpool and Wolverine, where she was depicted by a white woman, but coded as a person of color. And that would be Laura Kinney, aka Wolverine, also known as X-23 in her original incarnation. And, I'll retell it for the benefit of the listeners who did know her story. What that means her story is that, she's a clone of Logan, a clone of Wolverine, who was dehumanized for many years, did not have a name, was just referred to a whole quest number. Then, after she's escaped from this cloning facility, is trafficked into sex work as a teenager, and it sort of lives this runaway existence. So she goes from being a dehumanized weapon to a dehumanized weapon of violence to a dehumanized object for sex, and then goes on her sort of journey of self-discovery, where she finds her humanity, finds her name, rediscovers her genetic father, who comes to find out that she's not actually a full clone of Logan, and she does in fact have a mother. And sadly, her mother was one of the people who experimented on her. So there's a lot of tension there. But again, I would say that a big part of her story is a story that mirrors that of many many people of color. I would say that we don't want to get too close to political events that are particularly polarizing, but she was drafted by the SWANA MENA delegation, and those are things that are happening in many would say genocide, at least atrocities in that part of the world. I would say that there's a lot there that's mightable in terms of how poorly the people in that part of the world are treated and dehumanized. I think that that's to be very resonant for Laura Kinney, X-23 Wolverine as part of her story. So for me personally, I really like this pick. I really think it's a strong pick that I approve of. The listeners, a little bit more, 75% approval rating for SWANA Wolverine. And that would be 75%, so 25% strongly approve, 50% somewhat approve, and 25% strongly disapprove of recasting her and reimagining her either in that way. We move from the third pick to another character that has been, in a way, racially drafted in pop culture, and that would be Dinah Drake Lance, aka Black Canary. You might know her if you saw the Birds of Prey movie a few years back, where she was portrayed by Jurnee Smollett. Jurnee Smollett, who is African American and of Caucasian descent. I would imagine that would be the mix that the multiracial delegation drafted her would use, given that mother, Black Canary's mother, is also a superhero. It would make sense that to the extent that she's from a different time frame, maybe the original Black Canary may be a little bit more, even if she's white, or so even if she's something other than white. She would still be white passing, a little bit more white passing than this Black Canary, who again, we've seen her depicted with more melanin, so to speak. Obviously in the comics, she's still a white woman. And that does create less storyline reasons and but more pop cultural reasons why she might be a little bit less accepted in this racially drafted form. And I'm tipping my hand a little bit. Again, you can cast your vote at racialdraft.com. You still got many, many months where you can only vote once. So, make sure you weigh your decisions before you cast your vote. But for me, I do approve of multiracial Black Canary. And the people are a little bit 83.3% approval, 6.6 strongly approve, 16.6 somewhat approve, and 16.7 somewhat disapprove of multiracial. Comes to the halfway point of the round, and that is the Southeast Asian delegation. And they drafted Johnny Storm, Human Torch. This one, I would say there's not a lot, to really argue about. I mean, obviously, he's another person that's been traditionally depicted as a white man, but there's really nothing in his story that suggests that he has to be white. The main aspects of Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, are that he's young and hot-tempered and, very, rugged in his actions. And, obviously he started out young. So even though he's a little older now, he still has very much a youthful and someone might say immature spirit. But, there are people of all races and backgrounds that have that kind of personality, so to speak. In fact, I believe that in this instance, the Southeast Asian delegation who drafted him used the fan cast to sort of better cast the vision of what they had going for it in terms of what they were thinking about the character. Ross Butler, who you might know from the Riverdale series, where he played Reggie, he was chosen as their choice. I mean, I definitely think that maybe with slightly softer edges, smooth edges, so to speak. I think that he could portray the character fairly well. His public persona of kind of being, a bit of a wild child, I would say, fits this idea. So to the extent that if Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, was reimagined as Southeast Asian, I think that Ross Butler could portray him. So for that reason, I'm on the side of the voters here who are 100% approval for Southeast Asian Johnny Storm, with 85.7 strongly approve and 14.3% somewhat approve. With respect to the fan cast, little 87.5%, 75% strongly approve and 12.5 somewhat approve of Ross Butler. Moving from the fifth pick to the sixth pick, there's our friends of white delegation, often with the easiest job, as most characters in these universes are white. And, you don't get a lot of flack for keeping a white character white. And in this instance, I'm tricky, because they took a character that was reimagined and race bent into something other than white, but they drafted him based on the idea that he would probably return to being depicted as white. And that is Arthur Curry, aka Aquaman, back when This pick was made. It had just been announced that Jason Momoa was going to return to the comic book world and play Lobo, which meant that he was no longer going to be playing Aquaman in live action, which definitely opened the door to Aquaman being portrayed by a white man again. I mean, again, in the comics, they really haven't changed that much. Every now and then, they depicted him, with darker hair or with tribal tattoos, more akin to, Polynesian, but they never fully took away his ethnic identity in the comics. They kept him as a white guy. And I would imagine that going forward, that's going to persist. So they went ahead, did that racial draft, solidified Arthur Curry back in the realm of the Caucasians, the Caucasian. My puns are off. It's been a while. But for that reason, they 100% approval rating for still white Aquaman. And they did use a fan cast here. And this is an actor who actually has played Aquaman in the past, and that's Alan Richardson, who played him when he was younger in the Smallville universe. So 100% approval rating for that fan cast as well. I would say that this is definitely a physical Aquaman, more in keeping with the Jason Momoa imagining of this character. But again, white. Moving on from the white delegation to the South Asian delegation. Earlier in the round, we had Sue Storm. Earlier in the round, we had Johnny Storm, drafted by the Southeast Asian delegation. The South Asian delegation drafted Susan Storm Richards, the Invisible Woman. I would imagine that in order to make these two picks work, they would have to be either adopted or part of a blended family. So, that's a little bit of a storyline hurdle to overcome. Obviously, one of the more tricky aspects of Susan Storm and how she's imagined is that she's very much associated with a time frame, the 1960s, and a traditional model of femininity in the American space as a traditional housewife, that over time, as the role of women has changed in society, the role of Susan Storm and her autonomy and her agency has also evolved. Again, she was very much earlier in her time, was a lot more of a demure, and I wouldn't say hopeless, but not as forthright character that compared to the way she is now, where she is in a lot of ways seen as the leader, like I said, in a lot of ways, of the Fantastic Four. Even though Mr. Fantastic is the namesake of the fleet and the head of the household as the Mr. in the family, I would say that the Ms. Susan Storm Richards, or Mrs., as it were, is very much at the forefront of guiding both in the field and in morally what the Fantastic Four stands for and what they do. We're going to get a Fantastic Four movie this summer, and it remains to be seen exactly what her role is going to be in the MCU and going forward in culture. Obviously, in that depiction, she's going to be played by Vanessa Kirby, who is herself a white woman, a blonde white woman. So that isn't particularly match with what the South Asian delegation has going on in terms of their imagining of the character, but that didn't stop them from getting 100% approval rating for South Asian Sue Storm. We also got a fan cast for South Asian Sue Storm, and that was Simone Ashley, who you might know from the Bridgerton series. 5.8% approval rating for Simone Ashley, Sue Storm. So very strong showings for this race bending, even though different from what we've been served up in pop culture thus far, and what we can expect to be served up in pop culture in the near future. Moving on from Sue Storm is Barbara Gordon. It was very surprising that she was on the board as long as she had been. Jewish delegation scooped her up, and this is a character that, I would say sometimes gets overlooked as one of the more important members of the Bat family. She was Batgirl, and then she was Oracle, and now sometimes she's both. She was known for her crime fighting acumen in a more physical way, but now she is the quintessential person in the chair, the Overwatch figure who backs up and coordinates the activities of the Bat family, and also is a, top tier actor in the Bat universe. She, in a lot of ways, keeps Bruce Wayne on the straight and narrow. We've seen her across different pop culture properties. Sadly, we had the debacle where Warner Brothers made a Batgirl movie, but decided that it wasn't quite what they were looking for, and they shelved it. So Batgirl has a place in the fan imagination as it might have been as portrayed by Leslie Grace. We never got an opportunity to see what her portrayal of the character might have been like. But for that reason, I would imagine we're not sure if we'll ever get a Batgirl that is depicted as something other than at least is not white passing. The George delegation, in addition to drafting Barbara Gordon, they also pulled off a trade, which we'll talk about in a subsequent episode. We'll talk about the trade where, in addition to drafting Barbara Gordon, they also acquired Commissioner Gordon, Jim Gordon, as part of the Jewish delegation. Keeping the family together ethnically. But Barbara Gordon, the approval rating was a little low here, I think. Only 57.2% approval for Jewish Barbara Gordon, and 42.9% strongly approve, 14.3% somewhat approve, 14.3% somewhat disapprove, and a full 28.6% strongly disapprove. I'm going to go ahead and label that anti-Semitic. On the fan casting side, they just submit a fan cast. Zoe Dutch, I think is how her name is pronounced. I'm not too familiar with her work, so I can't really say one way or the other what's behind the approval here. But again, very low, 53.8% approval rating for Zoe Dutch as Barbara Gordon, with 46.2% strongly disapproving of the fan cast. Staying in with our Fantastic Four theme, I would say this one definitely controversial because we're talking about Ben Grimm, noted high-profile Jewish character, was drafted by the Latin delegation. And as I often say, when you draft a delegation, obviously it doesn't mean that you are erasing. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're erasing other identities from the character, but it does mean that what you're doing is you're saying this character primarily identifies or is identified as part of this delegation. So when the Latin delegation creates Latino Ben Grimm, he'd still be Latino and Jewish. However, he's going to consider himself Latino first. And it could be challenging in the thought process of a lot of Jewish fans or a lot of people who see Ben Grimm as a Jewish representation. He's another character, like I said earlier, the Fantastic Four will be coming this summer to live action. We're not going to be depicted as Latino. In the comics, clearly, big part of Ben Grimm's identity is being Jewish. So up against it a little bit, uphill climb in terms of this portrayal, this reimagining, if you will, of Ben Grimm, the Thing, as Latino. 60% approval rating for the pick, for the imagining. However, from a fan casting perspective, Bobby Cannavale was chosen as the fan cast. Bobby Cannavale is Cuban. 100% approval rating for Bobby Cannavale as Ben Grimm. I guess his New York-ness and his gruff, older New York personality does kind of match with what a lot of people think about when they think about Ben Grimm, particularly when he's not in his rock form. So I get it. Moving on to the final pick, the 10th pick of the 5th round, and this one's going to require a little bit of work on my behalf, so bear with me. We are talking about Billy Batson, aka Shazam. He is a character that's been around for a long time, and he goes back to the early, I would say, 90s, when he was almost as popular, at times more popular than Superman, and so much so that DC acquired the entire comic company, Charlton Comics, so they could bring him into the fold kind of sniffs him out in the crib, so to speak. He's never been as popular since being acquired by DC, even though he has maintained some level of relevant popularity. But I would argue that one of the things that could have made him more popular is being reimagined as a person of color, given the dearth of DC characters that are diverse. Now, granted, there's the Shazam family, where there is diversity among the other members of the Shazam family, but I think that if they were all people of color and they all have these powers of Shazam, I think that would give the character a niche that the characters sometimes lack, even if we understand his appeal is that he's a teenage boy, who gets superhero powers. I mean, it is a very cool pitch for a superhero, for especially comic superhero. But I just think that it could be done a little bit better with a person of color at the helm. Now, I didn't mention the delegation that drafted him because I'm a little bit daunted. But I'm talking about the Polynesian delegation and what the Polynesian delegation did, other delegations have done in the past, putting the Shazam acronym, the powers of Shazam, through the lens, the cultural lens of some Polynesian legends and deities. I will do my best. Again, apologies. I'm gonna be as respectful as possible. So there's Savasi Uleho, the god of Samoan heaven and also god of the Samoan underworld. That is the S. There's Hina, the Hawaiian goddess of the moon, who's also a Samoan legend underneath the name of Sina. There's so that's the 8. Atonga, the Samoan half-man, half-spirit hero. There's Anahari, Austronesian sky god. There's Afa, spirit in Samoan culture. And there's Mafure, the Samoan god of earthquakes and the keeper of fire. So the idea is that Shazam, represents a certain pantheon of legendary figures, typically in Greek mythology, but through a Polynesian lens, Shazam would be granted the powers of these Polynesian figures. I thought that was a good way of using the racial draft, and putting a beneficial spin on the character. And I think it's for that reason that 100% approval rating for Polynesian Shazam, which, every now and then it's good to see that the voters, the audience is responding positively to these race bands, because sometimes it comes out a little bit more negative. Speaking of casting your vote, like I said before, racialdraft.com is where you can find all of our picks. This was just round 5. We still have round 6, round 7, round 8 to recap before we get brought up to speed. Hopefully you'll listen to these other podcasts as we break these picks down. Feel free to comment on the various social medias, and also at racialdraftpodcast@gmail.com, where we will gladly read your emails. But again, if you want to just post comments at racialdraft.com, we'll read those too. You can find me and the Racial Draft Podcast at all the places that podcasts are found. You can find us and subscribe and like on YouTube. You could find us and subscribe on Blue Sky or Twitter or Instagram or Threads. And you can stay current and for all of those places, Facebook. They're the same thing, aren't they? Hey, Val, that's it for us this week or this round. Tune in next time. Same race time, same race channel. And until next time.